Hello, everyone. This is Carol Thomas, one of the Needham elected library trustees. Each year, the trustees sponsor a series of lectures in honor and memory of former library director Vivian McIver. Today's talk is the second McIver lecture of 2022. As with other of these virtual programs, the program is being recorded and will be available after the fact on the Needham Library YouTube channel, which can be accessed through either through YouTube or through the library website. For today's lecture, we will have questions. Please just type them into the chat and we'll address them towards the end, after our speaker has had a chance to present. Our speaker today, Dr. Noelle Eckley Selin, is a professor in MIT's Institute for Data Systems and Society and the Department of Earth, Atmospheric and Planetary Sciences. So two different departments, and is director of MIT's Technology and Program and Policy Program. That's a mouthful. Her research uses modeling and analysis to inform sustainability decision-making, focusing on issues involving air pollution, climate change, and hazardous substances such as mercury. As an expert, she has been called on to inform national and international environmental regulatory negotiations. Dr. Selin received her PhD and master's degrees in Earth and Planetary Sciences and her undergraduate degree in environmental science and public policy from Harvard University. She received a National Science Foundation Career Award in 2011 and has been the recipient of many fellowships, most recently in 2018 to 2021 at the Hans Fischer Senior, as a Hans Fischer Senior Fellow at the Technical University of Munich Institute for Advanced Study. Dr. Selin's book, Mercury Stories, Understanding Sustainability Through a Volatile Element, which you see on the screen, I believe, co-authored with her husband, Henrik Selin, was published by MIT Press in 2020. In the book, the authors analyze human interactions with mercury, map out important issues in mercury science, and shed light on efforts to promote and achieve sustainability through technical advances and governance. Then the authors distill insights for sustainability analysis more broadly and draw lessons for researchers, decision makers, and concerned citizens. Turning more specifically to today's talk, Dr. Selin has studied mercury and its uses in medicine, consumer products, industrial processes, power generation, scientific research, and artisanal small-scale gold mining, among others. She follows what happens to mercury from its mining to its uses and reuses, to the air, water, and land pollution that result, to the efforts to mitigate the harms for humankind through technical advances and governance. It is a complex story, as I found when I started reading her book, full of interconnections and a fascinating story. So without further description, it's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Noelle Eckley Selin.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really thrilled to be here, and thanks to all of you who took the time to be here on such a nice sunny day. I'm going to be talking about mercury. I've been working on mercury pollution for nearly 2 decades now, and it is what motivated my book, Mercury Stories. But one of the things that I think is so fascinating about mercury is that everyone has a mercury story. We already see one of them in the chat. The ubiquity of mercury as a substance in culture, but also in human experience, is really multifaceted. And a lot of people know mercury as a really interesting substance, a fascinating substance, but also a hazardous substance. So I really think that mercury is a really nice case to look at people's interaction with the environment and the ways in which human activities have altered the environment, both locally as well as globally, over actually millennia. And this is one of the things that I found really fascinating in doing the research for this book. But I think Mercury poses a lot of lessons to some of the major environmental challenges like climate change and like other hazardous substances that we as a society face today. So in telling the story of Mercury today, I'm sort of going to encourage you to think a little bit about how the lessons of how humans dealing with Mercury might inform some of the future challenges that we as a society face in terms of thinking about how people can live on the Earth more sustainably now and in the future. So let me start by telling you a little bit about Mercury, and I will start with at least one graph here. And this is on the left here. I'm showing the concentrations of mercury in humans and animals in the Arctic. And you'll see the year here goes from about the year 1200 to the year 2000. And the y-axis is in percent, so it goes up to 100%. And that means that we're saying, okay, well, whatever the measure of mercury concentrations in, for example, human teeth or teeth of a beluga or a ringed seal, in the present day, let's say that's 100%. Let's go back and look historically at what the concentrations of measurable mercury in teeth were, or hair or feathers, way back in history. And what you see is as you go back, there's less and less mercury that you can find. And this comes from a variety of different sources, like the last several decades you can get from museum specimens, for example. But if you'll notice that there's a human tooth here from the year 1200, comes from a mummified person that fell in a glacier in the Arctic. And they extracted that person and measured the mercury in the tooth, and compared to present day people in the Arctic, almost a factor of 10 difference in mercury. And that is a pattern that we see for a lot of different environmental contaminants. And it's a typical pattern that when people who study the environment look at, you really see the signal of industrialization here. What else happened in the late 1800s? Well, the Industrial Revolution happened in the late 1800s, and that mobilized a lot of different substances into the atmosphere, into the environment, that eventually made their way into people. And one of those was mercury. And mercury has gotten to levels around the world where in 2002, the United Nations Environment Program did an assessment of those mercury levels and said there was sufficient evidence of significant adverse impacts on human health and or the environment from the releases of mercury, from the ways in which mercury is entering the environment, to warrant global political action to address these issues. So that this signal, this graph, was not showing any limits, was going up and up and up. And the UN Environment Program in 2002 said, we as a global community should do something about that. And there is now a global treaty on mercury. It's called the Minamoto Convention on Mercury under the UN Environment Program. And it sets guidelines and regulations on what different countries can do with the aim of protecting human health and the environment from mercury. And that came into force in 2017. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about how that came to be and what the different kinds of challenges are. But the first thing I want to note is that, that the declaration that there's sufficient evidence of adverse impacts warranting global political action happened in 2002. And the entry into force of the global treaty, 2017, 15 years later. That's a pretty long time if you think about identifying a problem and then actually trying to deal with it. And that's unfortunately characteristic of a lot of the environmental problems and challenges that we see, and the ability to address them globally is that it takes a lot of time to negotiate and to craft global solutions. But I'll tell you a little bit about that process and how scientific research played a part in that. But going back to this signal of industrialization, of concentrations of mercury, which is a naturally occurring element, being relatively low in the Arctic up until the late 1800s and then rocketing upwards, that's something that we see in a lot of different environmental areas. And mercury really is emblematic of a lot of these different kinds of environment and sustainability challenges. It's intertwined with several of them. In the top left, I'm showing a power plant. Mercury is connected with the energy challenge because one of the ways that mercury gets into the environment and eventually into the Arctic is through burning coal. So mercury is a contaminant in coal. So the more coal that gets burned, the more mercury ends up in the atmosphere. It circulates through the air around the globe and ends up places like the oceans and in the Arctic. And so that's one of the major sources of mercury pollution today. And that's one of the reasons you see that post-industrial signal. It's very similar to what you see in carbon dioxide or climate change, where when a large amount of fossil fuels started to get burned in the late 1800s, that just really accelerated. So the top right is a picture of a small-scale gold miner. So mercury was actually used in historically up to a millennia ago in gold and silver mining. And mercury binds very closely to gold. So if you're thinking about sort of the gold rush, the California gold rush, old-timey gold mining, you're panning for gold. You have these little flecks of gold. How do you separate the little flecks of gold from the rest of the dirt and slurry? And one of the ways to do that is to dump a bunch of mercury into your pan. And this is the present day version of that. The gold binds to the mercury, and then you can burn it and the mercury comes off and the gold is left behind. So this isn't a particularly efficient way of mining, but it's one that's very accessible and straightforward. And there are artisanal and small-scale gold miners today in more than 70 countries, mostly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And recent science has shown that mercury coming from these processes could be the biggest source of mercury to the atmosphere today, potentially even bigger than coal burning. And that mercury also gets into the atmosphere and travels around globally, could eventually get into our waterways and into the Arctic as well. On the bottom, talking about why we're concerned about mercury being there in the first place, thinking about human health. So I mentioned that the global treaty on mercury is called the Minamoto Convention. And that's named after a town in Japan called Minamoto, where methylmercury poisoning was first identified. And these famous photographs from W. Eugene Smith starting in the 1950s, where mothers were exposed to mercury during pregnancy, and there were very serious impacts on their children, neurological damage, and sometimes even death that occurred because of that mercury poisoning. And it was a factory that emitted the particularly toxic form of mercury called methylmercury into the environment. And when we think about the hazards of mercury, it's methylmercury, that toxic form of mercury that actually mercury transforms into in the environment, and that accumulates in seafood, for example. So it's created in waterways and oceans and lakes and accumulates in seafood and poses a risk to consumers. And the risks that mercury poses are at much lower levels to most consumers today than we're seeing in the case of Minamoto, but it is of concern, and it's particularly of concern to vulnerable populations like pregnant women and children. So you might have seen this kinds of dietary advice that say, you shouldn't eat fish that came from certain waterways that might be contaminated with mercury. There's actually some even in the local area. Sometimes you see this, if you're walking around and look at rivers or lakes, there might be a don't eat fish because of contamination. Sometimes that's different contaminants, but some of the ones around are mercury. There are also certain fish that are higher in mercury, tuna, swordfish, which for those who are vulnerable, like pregnant women, avoiding eating that is important for health. But it's also important to eat healthy fish. So those with the least mercury, herring, scallop, shrimp, for example, are more encouraged for those vulnerable populations to eat. So this gives you a sense of how mercury is entwined with a lot of things that people care about. So energy, health, production, right? Food. And so you begin to see how mercury has kind of intertwined itself in a lot of these broader sustainability challenges. I did want to say a word, though, about Minamoto. And this leads to some of the work that we did in our book to talk about the long-term story of mercury. Because today, Minamoto in Japan looks like this. And this is a picture that I actually took during the signing of the global agreement to address mercury, the Minamoto Convention. And that was actually signed in Minamoto in 2013. It was a nice sunny day. It was in the fall. And the bay has actually been remediated. So they took the contaminated sediments and they put them in what's now an eco park. You'll see here, there's a little note in English that says Minamoto Bay reclaimed land. So it's a little bit elevated over the surface. And the mercury is mercury never goes away. It's an element, but can kind of encapsulate it away from the environment. And it's now a park and a museum that actually sort of tells the story of the people and the experiences of Minamoto. And that's really what inspired the title of our book, because when you visit the museum there in Minamoto, there are still people who are affected by mercury who live there. And they tell their stories in order to raise awareness of what the company has done, what their challenges were, living with this disease, getting the government to recognize that this disease was a problem, and to take remedial action. And there was a lot of stigma attached to being a Minamoto disease sufferer. And they used their stories to really counter that in society, to tell about their experiences in order to prompt action. So it's a really inspiring place to visit, to think about not only some of the things that have gone wrong in the past, but also some of the prospective things that society can do to repair and to look forward and to remediate the environment and think about the future. So with that positive story, I will go back a little bit to talking about some of the damages of mercury and some of the multifaceted ways it can affect people, just to give a little bit more detail on both the harms that mercury cause and the pervasiveness of the problem. The health impacts of mercury really depend both on the form people are exposed to and the amount of exposure. So many of you might be familiar with the silvery liquid form of mercury, so the kind that was present in old thermometers. And you might say, well, I played with an old thermometer as a kid and nothing happened to me. That's very much expected. People who are exposed to elemental mercury, the dangers are primarily at high levels in, for example, occupational settings. So, concentrations such as those that exist in the atmosphere, which are exposed to if you break just one thermometer, are not typically at levels dangerous to human health directly. Although if you do break a thermometer, do open a window and make sure you dispose of it properly. But if you're, for example, a small scale gold miner in over one of those 70 developing countries who is sitting over a burning amalgam of gold and mercury and inhaling very high concentrations of elemental mercury, or you're working in some of the factories that used elemental mercury, or some of the mines even as early as the 13 or 1400s, the dangers of elemental mercury exposure was very well known. So that, could affect, for example, the nervous system. But today, if you don't work specifically with mercury, you're likely exposed to mercury in the form of methyl mercury and predominantly through your diet. And largely that is through fish. And again, the impacts of most concern are on the nervous system, and in particular, babies born to women exposed to mercury during pregnancy are particularly affected. So nervous system and cognitive development. And the statistic I'm showing here comes from the early 2000s, when it was estimated that more than 300,000 babies in the US were born every year to women whose mercury levels exceeded the guidelines intended to protect against those effects. So this is a fairly widespread problem, and this is what prompted some of the early, this was actually a refrigerator magnet from that time, some of the earlier dietary advice on not eating the fish that are highest in mercury. But it's not just pregnant women and children. There's emerging evidence that mercury can affect other systems as well and may cause cardiovascular impacts like heart attacks in adults. So this is a widespread toxin in the environment that is causing impacts, both continuing occupational exposure, such as artisanal and small-scale gold mining, as well as to the general public. So where are emissions coming from? And this is actually the most recent 2015 inventory of where mercury is entering the atmosphere. And you can picture this as mercury enters the atmosphere, blows around, it ends up depositing to the oceans or lakes. It gets turned into methyl mercury, the fish take it up, and then people end up eating it. So think about that cycle. But we want to nail down where the mercury is coming from and where it's emitting. And you'll notice that that a lot of that is in the tropics. That comes from the artisanal and small scale gold mining. But there's also a lot in, for example, China and India. And that primarily comes from coal burning. So mercury emissions in the US and Europe have declined in the past several decades as a result of emissions controls. There was a very prominent mercury and air toxic standards that came into force in 2015. It's a regulation that I worked on some of the background science for. And so that's cut mercury emissions a lot. Air pollution controls also can cut mercury emissions. But a lot of that uncontrolled coal burning is still occurring in places like China and India and still actually affecting the globe. And despite all of the attention to mercury, it's estimated that globally there was a 20% increase of mercury emissions to the atmosphere between 2010 and 2015. And again, this is the same time period when there's a global treaty in the works, which isn't good news in terms of cutting the mercury problem off at its source. And one of the insidious things about mercury is that the legacy of past pollution is still present. So mercury is an element in the periodic table. And if you remember from some of your old chemistry classes, elements, they can't be created or destroyed, right? It's unless you do sort of nuclear types of energy, to a first approximation in the environment, mercury is going to be there forever. So once it's emitted or released, mercury actually is sort of has some properties that it continues to cycle. So that very nature that makes it really interesting when you hold it in your hand, it means it can vaporize really easily. It can condense again, and it does that in the environment. So I'm showing here, actually it's a plate of sushi that I had actually at a conference on mercury. So I can show you that piece of tuna sushi, which was delicious. It contains a combination of mercury that was kind of naturally occurring in the environment, a very small level. There came from volcanoes and circulated. It also contained mercury that was emitted recently, potentially from a power plant in China or India. But it also could have contained mercury that was emitted decades or centuries ago, that continue to cycle in the environment and accumulate in fish. And one of the scientific questions is, well, what fraction is each of those? And in what ways? And that tells us a lot about the speed at which we can expect, if we cut emissions, that the concentrations in your tuna will decline. So these historical sources stretch back centuries to millennia. So the picture on the right is from the Almudena mine in Spain. That operated for more than 2,000 years. It only closed in 2002. It's one of a few major mines worldwide. And I actually visited it in one of my last trips before the pandemic. I visited in January of 2020. And it's now a World Heritage Site, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And you can go down on a tour inside the mine. Over its history, it produced 250,000 tons of mercury. And one of the ways in which they used it was in gold mining and silver mining. In particular, Spain exported a lot of its mercury to South America, where it was used in silver mining during colonial times. And you can see, if you visit, for example, some of the cathedrals in that region of Spain, you see lots of silver. That's really beautiful silver. A lot of that silver came from colonial South America. And it's the mercury that was used in that silver mining had a lot of harms to the miners, but also could still be in the sushi that I ate on the left. The dangers of mercury were also fairly well known, at least the dangers to the miners. So you can, when you visit the museum in Almudena, they actually have the museum in their mining hospital. They had a special mining hospital where they treated as best they could centuries ago the severe health impacts of mercury exposure that the miners incurred when they were working with mercury. So these impacts were known for millennia, but we're still trying to figure out a lot of how mercury cycles in the environment and how quickly it can recover once we start pulling those emissions down. So hopefully I gave you a little bit of a sense of sort of what mercury problem was, but this was really what motivated the book, because we thought that this connectedness in history made mercury a really good case over so many centuries to examine how people have managed their interactions with this substance, which was very useful, but also very dangerous. So you see mercury, really fueling that production of silver, but at the same time, having very important and dire impacts on others. And so that's really what prompted us to write mercury stories. That and the international efforts really to come to terms with that history and to try to get the emissions of mercury moving in the other direction. So let me talk a little bit about that, and I'll talk about some of the prospects for mercury recovery as well. So this is the Minamoto Convention on Mercury is the global treaty that addresses mercury in all of its different forms and emissions. So it controls emissions to the atmosphere, releases to land and water from a variety of different sources. It actually aims to eliminate, bans primary mercury mining. So no more taking mercury out of the earth. We've got enough of it. has provisions in terms of environmentally sound waste disposal and storage, phases out a lot of mercury in products where it's not necessary anymore. And so it really addresses mercury from its entire life cycle. But in order to get there, the global scientific community first really established that this was a global problem. One of the things that it being a global problem means is that, you know, the US acting alone, for example, wasn't able to solve this problem itself. And part of that is because mercury lasts for so long in the atmosphere that it just travels and circulates globally. The other thing is going back to that plate of sushi, right? The tuna that came on that plate came from the middle of the ocean, right? So any one country that's regulating mercury on its own, the mercury that's in that tuna came from a mixture of all different sources from all different places if it was swimming in the middle of the Pacific. So global action was really necessary, all countries working together to really solve this problem. But there was a lot of time that went on before the agreement to actually negotiate a treaty. In 2005, countries agreed that mercury is a problem, but a lot of countries didn't think that a global treaty was really necessary. So, and in particular, the US at that time was very much in favor of voluntary approaches. So countries can work together voluntarily. We don't need all this legal action. So created a bunch of partnerships at the global level to try to address the mercury problem. And these still exist today. There's some partnerships that develop new technologies for artisanal and small scale gold miners to use that can assist those managing power plants to identify best practices for reducing pollution. So that's still going on, but it wasn't until 2009 that the UN Environment Programme's Governing Council decided to start treaty negotiations. And during that time, more and more countries were coming on board. The European Union was very much in favor of negotiating a global treaty. Latin American, Caribbean countries, African countries were also in favor. But what really made a difference actually was that the US was then in favor of treaty negotiations. And those of you might remember what happened between 2008 and 2009 in the US. In January 2009, President Obama was elected. And it turns out that President Obama actually had a particular interest in mercury, because when he was a senator, he had sponsored the US's Mercury Export Ban Act. So we knew a lot about mercury, and it made sense with a renewed commitment to global environmental issues that came in with the Obama administration that the US actually changed its position and decided that it was supportive of pushing forward with a global treaty. And that really tipped the balance globally. There were 5 negotiating meetings on 3 different continents. I actually went to 3 of those 5. And then the Minamoto Convention was adopted and open for signatures in 2013 at that meeting where I showed pictures of in Minamoto, Japan. And it took a few years for countries to sign up and to get that treaty to enter into force, but it did in 2017. And in fact, there is another meeting of the parties, a conference of the parties for the Minamoto Convention that's occurring next week in Indonesia. It's half virtual and half in person. I'm hoping to be able to follow it virtually. But back in 2013, I actually did take some students to the last negotiating session of the Minamoto Convention, which was in Geneva. I took 10 MIT graduate students, and we presented a bunch of the latest science that could be useful to policymakers and decision makers as they considered measures that could be taken and could be incorporated into the treaty to address mercury. So I want to make sure to leave some time for questions, but I'm telling you, in the book, we actually look at stories about the multifaceted nature of mercury. So in one of the chapters, we talk about some of the cycling of mercury in the environment and really how a mercury atom can travel across the world, where it goes, why it actually pops back up and down, why it's so so mobile in the environment and what that means for the timescales of this problem. We talk about mercury use in human health, and here's where there's some really complicated stories about mercury, because mercury is clearly a danger to health. But for many years and centuries, mercury actually turned up in medicines. Mercury was used as a treatment, for example, for syphilis. It wasn't particularly effective, and in fact, some of the symptoms of mercury poisoning kind of mimicked those of syphilis. So it wasn't particularly clear what was happening there. But before it was phased out, there were generations of mercury applications. Mercury was also used as a biocide. I see there's a note in the chat about mercurochrome, the red antiseptic that was fairly widespread even as late as the 1980s. It was widely used in some European countries. So lots of different aspects of health and areas where mercury is still very important in health. And one of those is for example, as a preservative in some vaccines, where this allows vaccines, because of that tiny little amount of mercury with biocide properties, to be much more widespread and reach places where they don't need refrigeration. And this is really vital to preventing a lot of other diseases. So thinking about those trade-offs of understanding where mercury was necessary and where mercury could potentially be phased out. There's an important energy story, coal, right? The use of coal in industrial areas and as an energy source really mirrors the mobilization of mercury. And the mercury that comes out of coal plants actually could both affect global mercury, but also really has an impact because of some of the ways in which it acts in the environment on very local places as well. So thinking about how air pollution and cleanup, particularly in the US and Europe, has addressed the mercury problem, but potentially shifted it elsewhere because heavy industry and uncontrolled pollution has shifted to other continents. Mercury was used in a wide range of different products, and I'm going to talk about that in particular and dive in. But thermometers, thermostats, compact fluorescent bulbs, paints, all sorts of different seed treatments, fungicides, pesticides, you name it, there's mercury in it. In the book, we catalog, this is more related to health, but the use of mercury, mercury was intentionally applied basically, to every bodily orifice. You can find a treatment of mercury that was applied to that part of the body. And that just showed the ubiquity of the substance. And in a lot of cases, the use of mercury actually had some positive impacts because it was such a novel substance. For example, the mercury process, the mercury thermometer was much better than what was used before, and enabled advances in science, technology, meteorology, and understanding of weather and the atmosphere. Today, it's not necessary because we have good digital thermometers. But thinking about when that use of mercury ought to have been phased out, probably much before it was actually phased out, is a really complicated thing as we think about novel technologies and new substances that might also be hazardous. How do you incorporate that that kind of thinking? And finally, we talk about the challenge of artisanal and small-scale gold mining, which is a really major sustainability challenge in different societies across the world. And so I just wanted to show a little bit about sort of the different ways in which mercury actually affected people. So again, prompted a bunch of advances in science, technology, and medicine. The discovery of oxygen was facilitated by mercury. It was used in a lot of labs that made really important discoveries. On the other hand, it was really dangerous. Here showing hat makers, mercury was used in the felting process, and it's controversial whether the term mad as a hatter actually refers to mercury or not, but the impacts to hat makers were certainly not controversial. And that was a very high area of exposure occupationally, historically. Again, fueled status and wealth. The gilded mirrors here in a museum in Denmark, mercury was used to make some of those old mirrors technologically, and really fueled, again, I talked about the silver wealth as well, but also energy efficiency. So today LED bulbs don't contain mercury, but 10 or so years ago, your only option was either an incandescent bulb or a compact fluorescent, which contains mercury. And at the time, there were a few assessments done that said, well, if you change your incandescent bulb to a compact fluorescent, yes, you have a little bit more mercury in the compact fluorescent, but if your energy is coming from coal, you actually end up releasing less mercury to the environment, especially if you're good about recycling the bulb and dealing with it in an environmentally sound way, not throwing it in the trash and returning it to a recycling facility. So again, that just illustrates some of the complexity of this story. And so I'll sum up by talking a little bit about climate change, and thinking about, and this is just giving you a little bit of a look at the kinds of things that my group does at MIT with relevance to mercury. And we look at a lot of models and scenarios of what will happen under climate change, under mercury policies, and ultimately, if CO2 emissions are going to meet a 2-degree target, or even a 1.5-degree goal, it's going to have to get rid of coal. How fast is that going to happen? And do you just solve the mercury problem there? Well, you certainly solve the mercury problem when there's from coal, when there's no coal being burned, but what happens on the way? And also with the understanding that mercury, once released, continues to cycle, it's really important to deal in the near term with some of the kinds of controls that can prevent mercury from going out into the environment. So we looked at a bunch of different scenarios in terms of coal phase outs and saying, well, will the coal phase out be enough to solve the mercury problem in the near term? And our answer was pretty much no. We looked at China in particular. The types of controls that the Paris Agreement, the climate change agreement put in, were not reducing mercury far enough and fast enough to actually make a dent in the problem. And you really needed a combination of these different strategies. So a lot of the work that my group at MIT does is really trying to understand what those strategies are and inform decision-making on a detailed level for different countries and in different places to try to understand the cycling of mercury and the different ways in which controls could eventually benefit people in the near term and in the longer term. So again, want to make sure I leave some time for your questions, but just as a plug, we also have mercury has been really also important in popular culture. And to illustrate that, if you go to our website, mercurystories.org, you can link to a Spotify playlist of songs that have some relevance to mercury. So I'd encourage you to take a listen to that if you're interested in hearing more mercury stories. And with that, I will open it up for questions, and thanks so much.
Okay. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yes, great. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, so let me just give you a couple of my questions that I was hoping that you could answer. And could you just clarify with that last slide, the connection between mercury level and climate change, which I sort of associate with level of CO2?
Right, so the key is there's a couple of them, but what I was trying to illustrate there was mercury comes from burning coal. CO2 also comes from burning coal. So, if you don't burn coal, you also don't release mercury. But the speed at which countries are phasing out coal means that in the process, not only is a lot of CO2 released along the way, but a lot of mercury is still released along the way. And in the meantime, there's no way at a coal plant to control and make the CO2 not go into the atmosphere. But there are ways that can prevent the mercury from getting into the atmosphere. So technological, what are called end of pipe controls. Think like something that you put on the top of the smokestack to screen the mercury out before the emissions go out into the atmosphere. And that is one of the ways that that will be important in the near term to address mercury in the context of efforts to transition to a cleaner energy future. So that's part of it. The other thing is that obviously the climate drives the mercury cycle as well. So, melting and heating up will make mercury move around differently. So in that, there's also a link between mercury and climate change there.
Could I see there are two questions now in the chat. The first, let's just say, can you describe the ways mercury is recovered and recycled and stockpiled or reused?
So yeah, there's a couple of different ways. The main thing is to make sure that mercury is either in a form or in a place where it doesn't get out into the environment. And so, one of those forms is to bind mercury with sulfur, for example, mercury sulfide, and put it in a storage facility that isn't sort of exchanging with the environment. For example, in some mercury hazardous wastes, there are salt mines actually that are used for that purpose in European context. So in Germany and Austria, there are some salt mines that have been repurposed as old salt mines repurposed as mercury and hazardous waste storage because they're places that aren't subject to the elements. But yeah, there's a variety of different ways. The challenge is that mercury in the environment is at concentrations that are so low, so it's really hard to sort of gather it all together. So mainly you're looking at trying to prevent new releases to the environment and looking at those industrial sites where there's a high concentration of mercury and you can kind of gather it up and try to prevent it from going further.
And reuse what is gathered up?
Well, at this point, we don't really want to reuse it, right? Because if you use it in a product, we're trying to ban those mercury containing products. So, ideally, if you do continue to put mercury in products, then you should be using reused mercury as opposed to primary mercury, and that's part of banning primary mercury mining. But ultimately, and hopefully very soon, you won't be wanting to use it at all.
Excellent, thank you. I had this wondered, and I see that there's a question in the chat also about alternate ways to purify silver and gold without using mercury. Are there alternatives now or not really?
There are alternatives, and it's interesting because I really emphasize the artisanal and small scale gold mining. Really, the only people who are using mercury now are the sort of individuals, and some of that is relatively mechanized. People using power tools, but the big sort of conglomerates, industrial scale gold mining has moved on from mercury. The main thing they're using, however, is cyanide. So you do have some environmental problems that are associated with that as well. So the kinds of alternatives that have been proposed for artisanal and small scale gold mining, there are some sort of methods that involve special basically physical separation of the gold. So using gravity, different kinds of sort of processing methods that take into account sort of physical separation as opposed to chemical separation. So these haven't been adopted in a widespread way yet, but there's certainly a lot of engineers and technological innovation going on in that sector right now, and trying to get people to adopt them when they're doing artisanal mining in all of these different places, which often happen in conflict-prone regions in the informal sector. So it's really hard to sort of get that message out and get safer technologies adopted.
About what percentage do we know of the mercury that escapes as vapor into the air comes from this small scale gold mining?
So it's probably about 40% globally.
So that's huge. That's a huge number.
Yeah, it's about 35% from coal, maybe about 40% from artisanal mining, and then the rest a sort of mix of different sectors. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a really huge source. But again, there's a lot of uncertainty because, with coal, at least you kind of have some good statistics on where people are. You can kind of locate the coal-fired power plant, and then estimate the amount of mercury based on their power consumption. And even though that's hard to do globally in terms of statistics, there's decent statistics on, for example, CO2 emissions. So you can kind of scale that to get an idea. But for artisanal and small scale gold mining, oftentimes the mercury is illegally imported. You're trying to figure out how much mercury an individual miner might use per kind of gold that they're getting. A lot of times they're selling gold through various informal channels, not all of which is reported to the government, obviously. So getting a sense of how much gold they're selling might well be a really difficult thing. And then figuring out how much mercury they use and how much is emitted to the air is really a challenge. Yeah, we're working on a project right now in a region of Peru together with an anthropologist who has deep connections in the region to try to get a better handle on mercury as a artisanal and small scale gold mining as a sort of multifaceted sustainability problem. And there's a lot going on in these communities.
I just had one or two more questions. I don't see any more in the chat so far, so I would just ask my questions. But what about chlorine? I know chlorine, there's beneficial uses, and then again, what could you tell us about chlorine and the use of mercury to isolate it or create it?
Yeah, so that's another example where sort of the process of chloralkali production. So the creation of sort of distillation of chlorine as a feedstock in chemicals is sort of mercury was used in that process, and it was when it was introduced, it was a big sort of step forward in terms of efficiently producing chlorine. But like mercury, chlorine has sort of positive and some beneficial uses. For example, chlorination of water supplies, when you could suddenly kill the bacteria in your water supply, all waterborne diseases went way down. But on the other hand, chlorine gas and a lot of the chlorine containing chemicals are really nasty stuff. The local impact also of using that mercury, because the mercury was not, the process wasn't very efficient and contaminated a lot of local ecosystems. For example, a lot of these happened in sensitive regions because the chlorination process was oftentimes co-located with paper mills. So because you're bleaching the paper, you needed the chlorine. So these are sensitive ecosystems that to this day, many of them are contaminated with mercury. So really thinking about sort of, who benefited from those. Oftentimes it was sort of economic benefit to factory owners, for example, but harms to workers. These kinds of stories come up over and over again. But putting yourself in and saying, well, widespread use of chlorination in tap water, probably a good thing. use of chlorine and a bunch of different hazardous chemicals is more problematic. How do you think about regulation and sort of management in ways that minimize the harm and maximize the benefits? It's not saying, okay, you can never, develop or use any substance. Clearly, there are some that are beneficial. So thinking about how you would do that from a regulatory approach is a really interesting question. And it's a question that people in the public ought to be weighing in on, right? What kinds of approaches, what kinds of risks are acceptable or not? How should regulators deal with unknowns? And this is something that ought to be a more of a community decision in the future.
Thank you. That was so it's a balancing act to some extent, and
it is, and unfortunately, historically, the balance has not been to the environment and not been to the most vulnerable people. So that's a really important thing that came out in the book, is that that balance has not been the right one historically. So what we have to do is find that right balance that values people both in the present and in the future.
Yeah. Well, that actually isn't not a bad place to stop. I would just ask if you had any further sort of comments about what people should do as concerned citizens, or what's sort of what's next in your field. You said there's a meeting, another.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a few things that concerned citizens can do. The mercury and air toxic standards, although they've been in place since 2015 and have had many benefits, they're still a little bit up in the air in terms of their legal status right now. It's gone back and forth with different governance structures. So making sure to pay attention at the state level and the federal level when these when there are proposals, and if you support more action to reduce pollution in the environment, really making that known. So and then I think there are certainly a lot of in terms of the big challenges of climate and sustainability action, obviously the bigger goals and the faster we can get to sort of things like phasing out coal, the many benefits that people will see sort of in the near term, as well as the longer term benefits of climate change. And so I think, really talking about some of these issues and really understanding sort of what the benefits are for both present and future generations, and that these are all linked. It's if you're concerned about mercury, you should be concerned about climate change, and vice versa. There are connections between all of these environment and sustainability issues, and also issues that affect human well-being. So really needs all of us to act and really better understand and move forward.
Well, I don't see any other questions, so I think we'll leave it at that. But thank you so much. It was a most interesting talk, subject I had little other information about until I happened upon you and your book. So thank you so much. And as I mentioned at the beginning, that your talk will, as a recording, will be available through the library YouTube channel, which is excellent. So that people like me that sometimes, have last minute problems attending can go back and see what happened. So thank you again. And that'll be it for today.
Thanks so much, and really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.